Dr. Nikki K. Michaels is a mother first and foremost. She is currently the interim president of Bacone College and is the executive director of the Indigenous Studies and Curriculum. Dr. Michaels holds a BA in American Studies from Stanford University, an MA in History from Oklahoma University, and a Ph.D. from the University of Oklahoma. She is the only Lenape woman to use her language for both her MA and Ph.D. language requirements. Michaels is a member of the Delaware tribe and has served her people as an elected leader for 10 years. She and her family are active in the Lenape culture. She has numerous publications, and her most recent with Camellia Townsend, entitled On the Turtle's Back, Stories the Lenape Told Their Grandchildren, was recently published by Rutgers University Press. Dr. Michael's topic today is Lenape Ecology, How Lenape Honored the Earth.
Kulumosi hamohech, Delawensi opatayahwe Lenape ni, Niguis, Ampekinu, Ok Tachkokan Ilawakon, Ok Shakakahane. Good morning, my name is Nicky Michael, and I am very happy to be here, Nulalindam. And today we are going to be talking about Lenape agricultural practices. And this gentleman in the first slide is our Missing. He is called the keeper of the game animals. The Missing itself is the face, half red, half black, and then he wears a robe of usually bearskin, and then a rattle. Go to the next slide, and what we're going to talk about today involves indigenous pedagogies, but it also involves applying that pedagogy to the Lenape people. So let me just express what exactly we're talking about when we say pedagogies, because it's a pretty big word, and while it's a buzzword in academia, it doesn't necessarily always cut across all spectrums with the same meaning. But indigenous pedagogies might be defined as those that emerge from and center the peoplehood, cultures, values, and intellectual traditions of indigenous communities in relation to the particular places those communities come from. Now, we also need to look at a couple of other definitions when it comes to agriculture. And one of those is subsistence, and that means farming only for what you need and what your family will eat, so that it's equivalent to a lot of small farms today, but certainly not the commercial farming that most of us are used to seeing when we drive through certain areas like Colorado or Nebraska. Sustainability, on the other hand, while it's closely related to subsistence and it involves subsistence farming, sustainability is more of a communal definition, and it's a system that strives to provide all the resources for the entire population, whether that's a local community or whether that's a surrounding state. This is also about planning for future, and it incorporates systems of medicines, healing, reconciliation, and education. Among most sustainable cultures, there are elements of reciprocity, but particularly for those in indigenous communities and the Lenape, reciprocity is a huge factor in how most people conduct themselves, and it's likened really to being a good relative, and you'll see that in a lot of American Indian studies books or narrations or whatever you look at in terms of understanding indigenous cultures. You're going to find that reciprocity is at the center. And of course, this all also involves much of the intellectual and spiritual life. With Lenape, that connection to the spirits, Manitowoc, and art as well as creativity come out of all of these worldviews. Now, with the Lenape, it's really critical to understand that there are elements in nature that are stronger than any one of us individually. And those elements are what is the lifeblood, basically, of Mother Earth. And but water is particularly important to that. So uh, I have a slide, and I've put bi is the word in Lenape for water, but bisun is the word for medicine. And as you can see, bi and bisun, if you break it up, obviously the water part of this is, connected to medicine. So water medicine. But that's a worldview that in knowing the language, you're able to connect how strongly water is looked upon as a healing force. And then also involved in this is that we have a lot of songs. Now, none of them are necessarily about water, but the way that songs are developed in songs or sung in Lenape, there are certain verses that you repeat, and a lot of it does sound like the waves of water. All right, so the next slide is about fire. And of course, first element is water, and then another element's fire. And we have what we call our stomp dance ways. The southeastern tribes used stomp dances for thousands and thousands of years, and the Delawares are similar in the sense that we connected to it, though we all do it a little different. And so that's why I want to make sure to connect the fact that we are stomp dance people, but there are other tribes that do it, and the basic elements, though, are very similar. The fire, of course, is at night, and oftentimes we'll dance late at night, but sometimes all the way, if it's a ceremony, it'll go all the way to the next day and the sunrise. And each night, then we're out there with a stomp dance leader, and the women shake shells with turtle shells. We also use milk cans and put rocks or beads in them, and that also keeps time. And you'll see that each of the people is following the person in front of them, and our legs are usually in sync. We're trying to stay on the same step, but we're also keeping the beat. And then we're following the leader right here. Now, this is the other element that we need to address, and that is Mother Earth herself, the soil. Kahesena Haki, Mother Earth. And so, like water, if you pick it up with your hands, you're going to be able to cup it, but it's going to go ahead and leak out as you open and spread your fingers. So I want to encourage everyone to think about that, because when we think about land ownership, and when we're talking about European concepts of land ownership, when we're thinking of Lenape or indigenous perspectives, we never were able to sell the land. We never saw it as a sellable commodity, mostly because it would be the same way. You would pick up soil, aka the land, and it would go through your fingers much like water. Though now we are also starting to commodify water, and we're commodifying air. So there's a huge difference between those sustainability practices amongst our traditional indigenous peoples and making these things, these elements, something that we can bottle up and sell. It's not going to be a good result. Now, we also have in our prayers, and in our dances, and our ways of being, we acknowledge the four directions, and you can see that in the medicine wheel. That is probably the most obvious sign of it. But the earth is also one direction, like going down and honoring Mother Earth, but there's also the sky and the stars. Now, the cycles and seasons of life are critical to understanding agriculture, especially the priority of being a good relative, because being a good relative means that we're feeding each other. We're doing what we're supposed to to ensure the survival of our relatives and our community. So there were certain systems and rhythms over thousands and thousands of years that the Lenape people used to do that. So agriculture was particularly important to the spring, summer, and fall months, but so were gathering and hunting at certain times. And dancing would take place as a way of praying and ensuring that those crops come in and that the food is going to the nourishment of the people. In the winter is very limited to when we can tell stories. And why this is critical is because, and you're going to see this later on in the slideshow, storytelling is our education. And that tells us everything from why we exist to, more of the trickster stories. There's various stories that help describe and communicate what life is about. And then also involved in that, life cycles. So young people or youth, adults, and those are likened to certain seasons. So spring is the birth, summer and fall are the youth, and wintertime is the elder. Now I want to show you a picture of our original professor. This is an elder, but it's not just her as a professor. It would be all elders. And of course, there are some differences between olders and elders. So I just want to kind of say all older folks, we give that credit to. We try to honor them as being someone who has grown to that age. But there's also what an elder is, and that's the one that holds the knowledge and they're usually very, very kind-hearted and want nothing more than to just help young people and the community itself. Now, in ancient times, at least in the idea of European times, what they say ancient, archaic, whatever, some of those first old ones that the Lenape can identify and come from are those Hopewellian cultures that had the mounds. So I just want to kind of put this in here. This was some of the original means of being able to be in a community. The earthworks, they're likened often to the wonders of the world. They lived in some of these dwellings. They used some of them as trash pits. They were very developed cities. And so while these are not necessarily along the coast, those kind of areas were similar to being in the vicinities of all of those other Hopewellian cultures. Now, for Lenape, as we are in the east, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, we have gender and age roles, as well as public education. That's what I'm talking about with the elders. But education also includes going out and doing things, going out and picking the berries, going out with uncle or grandpa for a hunt. So that children are taught by doing. The classroom is not inside, it's not with a chalkboard, it's with the instruction of older people and younger people doing what is being demonstrated to them. Food allocations are critical to understanding the agriculture systems because obviously, you've got to eat, and so how is that distributed amongst those family units? So everybody has to contribute, whether it's the mother, the father, the grandmother, the grandfather. They are all important, and they all need to eat. So this also then, of course, goes into economic systems and trade. Now, a lot of people don't think indigenous peoples had trade. Excuse me. They had vast networks of trade, to be honest. Vast networks. We don't even know to the full extent of what kind of trade was going on. We know this not just with our indigenous knowledge that has been passed to us, but we know it from archaeological evidence when we see abalone shells in the middle of the United States, when those only come from seafaring places, beach places. So that trade should have had an impact on bringing that shell inwards. So again, we are looking at the family structure. The units of a family are the most important cultural unit for sustaining life and people. Each nation in this country or in the rest of the world, every tribal nation, they're going to define family differently. So it's not always going to be the nuclear family, mom, dad, kids in one dwelling. It's going to be often the extended family, aunties and uncles, as well as cousins. So for indigenous peoples, often those moms, their aunties, are also considered moms. Their uncles are considered dads. Their cousins are like brothers and sisters. And critical to understanding this is the elders should never be left alone to care for themselves, and there's never any orphans. And the reason for that is because, if something happens to mom or dad, there's that safety net of having that nuclear family, and that child would never be left without some guidance. Okay, so practical purposes of extended family are, you would think, self-explanatory, but not necessarily. So hunting and farming were much easier when practiced in groups. As you can see, this is a dugout canoe. They're all working together to burn that out. And that took everybody's involvement, as well as, gathering. If it's a group of women going out and gathering, it's going to happen much faster than if one or two go out. And with Lenape, it was called Lenapeosi, means to live the Lenape way. And that's the sustainability of it is to use those practices in tandem with each other. It also, extended families helped to ensure protection. The dependence on relatives and friends would also be something that created strong bonds, because if you're going out and picking berries, or if you're going out to hunt, then you've got to rely on each other. So prosperity occurred when everybody was fed and everybody had all that they needed. And of course, when we're talking about extended family, strength and efficiency were critical, and that was only through high numbers of people. Now, again, the original education structures were from a matrilineal and matrilocal perspective. That means that indigenous peoples, at least for the Lenape people, we had the clan system and the identity fall through the mother. And the mother is the critical role of that family. So the social unit, the home dwelling, all of that was grandmothers or mothers. And that was also important to understanding what girls were expected to do. So they would emulate their mothers, they would emulate their aunties. Same thing can be said for fathers, except for the fact that, again, he's more of the guest status. If he is living with his wife in that dwelling, he can come and go, but they still have to maintain that marriage. If she decides that he's no longer going to be her husband, then she sets this stuff outside. And that's still practiced today. Learning was experiential, so it's not reading out of a book, it's not having a how-to. It is, okay, watch grandma, watch mom, watch auntie, and they'll show you how to do something. Just like picking the good berries, they would, explain to the young people what they were looking for when they were gathering. But also, in that, this is the reciprocity part of this. In teaching, especially if a man was to go out and teach a younger nephew or somebody to go hunt, they would assuredly use some sort of tobacco to thank that animal for giving its life to us. That is, again, still practiced today. That came about thousands and thousands of years ago to really commemorate and understand that we're just of nature, just like all the other creatures, the four-leggeds, the flyers, that we're not above nature, we are within it. And so that, the education that we know of today in the classroom, kind of disconnected from nature, is completely opposite of what our ancestors did. For Lenape sustainability, there are some activities that we did that most people may be familiar with but are not quite sure. And so depending on where the Lenape were, some of them were more by the ocean and had much beach to be able to fish, as well as collect all the different shells and clams that they could, and of course they ate those. The nets were what we used for fishing, and so there was no hooks or anything of that sort when we fished. It was in mass scale. You will see over here too, you may not understand, but that's actually what we're putting in the soil. That is to fertilize those seeds. And they knew from an early stage that all life is connected, and those phytonutrients are connecting to each other. So women, while mostly the men are out doing the fishing, but those women are what created the nets, and then of course they turn around and the women are planting here. In 1491, a Lenape or a Delaware woman's life was about taking care of her children and family and community. In 2023, a Lenape Delaware woman's life is still about taking care of her children, family, and community. This just gives you a kind of example of what that looks like. Even this is early in the 20th century, but this is Mary Waters, and she was one of our elders at the timing of this picture. She's passed away since, but just a beautiful lady, and we love having her fry bread, and that's what she's making here. Women held great status as life givers, and this is why women were the agriculturalists. Now, spirituality is strongly connected to life and life-giving. So you'll see a picture of our shells right here. That is what we're talking about when we're saying stop dancing. Those are what we wear on our ankles. And this is closely connected to when we're mothers of babies. You can see Red Day here. And then one of our older ladies, Grandma Jackson, when she was holding a baby. Now, cultivation and planting took place in the spring. The harvests took all summer and fall. Again, this is the sustainability part of indigenous livelihood and Lenape livelihood, because they were preparing for long term. They weren't just fixing enough for the family. They were preparing it in various ways to be stored and available for either trade or winter, so that they wouldn't starve. And the spirituality that is also part of this era and needs to be addressed in the fall is what we call the Hingwikan. It's called the big house. Now, again, you see the missing, the face, and this is what our big house was in. You can see it looks like a log cabin, and it was hidden so people couldn't see it. So in this ceremonial house, that is the time that we would consider ending our old year and starting our new year. It was very spiritual, and it took 12 days, and it involved all of the activities that would demonstrate that connection with the Manitowoc, the spirits. And of course, that's really critical to understanding Lenape perspectives. But we won't go into those details of the big house. Just suffice to know that it existed and that's what we used as our annual commemoration, our New Year, and that it was an intense time of prayer. In the winter, those are the times that we'd stop and tell stories. It's cold outside, so we're not necessarily able to do the same kind of things. The agriculture may or may not grow the same way. But this is the time that we could go inward and connect with our relatives. The elders or storytellers would oftentimes share those different stories, and those were to pass on that knowledge, and it also informed what lessons we were to take away from those stories. So farming itself had certain methods, and it's not what we conceive of today, although you're seeing more and more of the kind of creativity that goes along with it. But the science that was involved came back from thousands of years ago when our indigenous women developed grass into the type of corn that they used. But it was much more like grain for them. It's not the same as what we're used to, is that yellow sweet corn of today. The grainy corn that were used in the past was for bread, it was for porridges, it was for putting together with meat or beans, and in general was much, much more nutritious. The Three Sisters particularly, but there were three sisters of various kinds of corn, various kinds of squash, and that intercropping is what we call it today. In general, what is a recommended alternative system for those small-scale farmers, and it improves the yield and the output. The reason for that is not just the fact that they guard each other, and the corn grows first and it's tall. The beans wrap around the vine, and so it has support from the corn stalk, but the beans also give some nitrogen and phytonutrients to exchange with the corn, and then the squash acts as keeps the control of the weeds, and it acts as a shade, and it keeps the moisture in the soil because the sunlight goes right to the leaves instead of down into the ground. We also used fish with those seeds, and that acted as a fertilizer. Now, this is the critical part of all of this, and I want you to think about how indigenous bodies developed for thousands and thousands of years using, game animals, proteins particularly, for their nourishment. And as they transitioned to the gardening and agriculture methods, they also created another system of a protein, which is not really understood in many circles. And it comes from the energy that's produced by those intercropping systems, particularly the Three Sisters. And then when they cooked them together, they often had the type of nutrition such as the potassium, the manganese, phosphorus, and even vitamin A. And when they mix them together, the nutrients helped your body to absorb those things. And that's what we're talking about when it comes to the dish called succotash. It enhances the nutritional benefits of each other in your body. Now, our Northeast Algonquin tribes, not just the Lenape, but primarily the Lenape, were so successful in their cultivation that this became a hub area for trade. And I'm talking about pre-Columbian trade, not necessarily post. Though there are some articles that do discuss how, while Lenape were not in the fur trade at the very beginning, their kind of trade source was corn, And so they were very responsible, especially for the Swedish colonies, in supplying them with the type of corn that they grew. Susquehannocks of the Pennsylvania also traded wampum, which the Lenape were privy to, beads and nets for the furs from the Hurons of the Great Lakes region, and so on and so forth, so that the reciprocity goes into what we understand more of an economic system. Trade created much of this tension that also came to be as a result of trade when the colonists arrived, because typically the greater and most, I guess you would say, violent of the tribes, the Iroquois, they held their ground, and there was a lot of tension between them and the Algonquins, and so there was much fighting. But it tended to be those northern areas, especially in New York, and any of the Lenape still in that area. Typically, they would get the fur trade benefits versus those that were down in Pennsylvania. Again, women were instrumental in this, in agriculture. At the time of the European invasion, many were already planting and harvesting. Entire communities were eating from this produce. They were also producing enough for the trade. And to kind of get an example of what that would look like, we have to look at today's Reconstruction. There's not a lot written on it because, and in fact, I see a lot of contradictory evidence, and they call that archaeology and anthropology. And in one book, you'll find that there was a lot of agriculture going on with the Lenape in the Northeast. In another book, they said, no, it wasn't until after Columbus got here. And regardless, I would stick with what my people said, and also the Reconstruction that is taking place. They produced at least 150 to 300 bushels per acre, and today's farming, that in those monocultural systems, they produce 170 to 180 bushels per acre. So you can see that up to 300 per acre is much larger than the 180. Now, gathering is another food source, and something that was very instrumental in the life cycles and the seasonal cycles. So while men went out and did the hunting, and that was often for moose, caribou, especially deer, and small game also, but the women were gathering particularly blueberries and all the other kind of berries that grew naturally. And they could also use those in long-term sustainable practices. And when they lived near the various rivers, they would fish and collect the shellfish as well. And cooking methods, we're not going to get into those specifically, but we can talk about just enough to say that the needs for gathering, the needs for farming, and the needs for cooking the yields all meant that they needed pots. And so they developed pottery and also wove baskets. Now I want to take us to the map of what happens when we are here in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and then forced to migrate hundreds and thousands of miles in some cases to, at this point, would have been Indian territory. And then we have some Lenape who stayed up here with the Iroquois, some who went up to Wisconsin. Those are the Muncies and the Mohicans. But the main bodies of the Lenape, my tribe, the Delaware tribe of Indians, went from Arkansas to Kansas to Oklahoma. Our sister nation, the Delaware Nation, they came down through Texas first and then went into Anadarko, Oklahoma. Now, I can't get into all of our cultural activities, but this is one of them, and it's actually one of the pictures from the 70s. You'll see Nora Dean in here. This is the bean dance, And as we've discussed, this is the being part of the three sisters. And I want you to imagine if you're in this line, you're holding hands, and you have a tribal leader singing the songs, and we're all singing together, holding hands, going around it, just like a bean vine would make all these curves and weave in and out. And it's a really fun activity and a really fun dance. We use those dances after every meal. We would sing them, and the kids would come out and do them. And if you can imagine all that energy flowing through the people is much like what would be the energy flowing through the bean vine and the squash and the corn. So this is actually kind of a silly picture, I thought. It kind of made me laugh in a good way. These are some of our elders of today, just kind of trying to get organized before an event, and somebody snapped this shot, and you can see Homer over here with this. He's one of our ranchers, and he's got his hat on sideways, and this is another one of our elders that she was the oldest elder in the local area. And Chief Brooks was alive at this point. He has since passed. And anyway, I just wanted to share that, like, this is what we look like today. Video. But here's some of the more prominent families. And again, I want to kind of emphasize that we did continue these practices as we moved, but at the same time, we had to adjust in each move. So we go from a seafaring kind of fishing culture to a plains culture, including hunting bison, to Oklahoma, where then we're actually forced to be agriculturalists. And in here you can just see some of these ladies, and then this would be about the 1930s, 20s maybe even, just enjoying the river. Here's the Foley family. And again, these are pictures to show, you know, what we did once we finally got to Oklahoma. It's not like the Delawares just disappeared. We were removed and revitalized our ways here in the local area of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So the fall leaves are some of the more instrumental of the families. They come from the Elcare family, who also were traditionals in the big house. And so here, as you can see, the big house in the background, and this is one of the families, the Andersons. It's a really old picture because the big house is no longer standing. It was torn apart after the 1940s by Boy Scouts, and so we're still finding some of our parts from that ceremony in various museums throughout the country, and it's always kind of a surprise when we do walk in and see our stuff. Here are some elders. Of course, this is Nora Dean, and this is her doing a demonstration of braiding the corn to store for the winter. And this is her in Pennsylvania early in the 1970s. Nora also was one of our last fluent speakers of Lenape. She grew up speaking it, and after her was Lucy Parks Blaylock, and we'll see her in just a second. Yep, there she is. Lucy Parks Blaylock was our last female fluent speaker, meaning she grew up with the language. When she passed away in 2000, she had done tremendous work in revitalizing Lenape, teaching Lenape, and add to that we have a talking dictionary that has many other elders speaking on it. So if you want to listen to those words and hear our actual fluent speakers saying them, you can get on the Lenape Talking Dictionary. Now Lucy is dressed in Lenape attire right here. She's got, you know, the hairpiece that goes on the back of her head and lots of silver. And then her daughter, Ruthie, was a painter, and so she painted this Lenape dress. Here she is again, Lucy, and this is her working with other folks. Well, she's actually here with Nora at this point, and they're looking at names for colors. Here she is again, daughter Ruthie Blaylock, and you can see all of her paintings. Now, as we've moved into contemporary society, our women have taken on different roles and expanded their roles as well. So we have Sarah Boyd here. She is, and then we have Dawn Duchesne, who occupied the Oceti Shakawan for almost a year at Standing Rock when the water protectors were there. This is one of the last flags that was standing there at Standing Rock was our Lenape flag. Here's some of our war mothers. This is actually not that long ago, but man, this young lady is now in graduated high school and in college, and so much time goes by, but yet it's so fast at the same time. So, yeah, these are our elders. This is Mary before she passed. Pat, Kay, she was just notified she was Elder of the Year, and former Chief Paula Pachonik. All right, and here's some of our dancers, contemporary dancers, powwow circuit dancers. And then I also want to these are some of our community members who've given of themselves over the years. Patsy Martin, and this is Elena, and she is the great-granddaughter, I believe, of Ollie Beaver, one of our Western Delawares. And she does actually more work with the Caddo than the Lenape, but she's a very strong figure in our communities. Here's the Delaware Nation when they elected their first woman chief, Deborah Dotson, and that was July 2017. And then Paula Pachonik was our first woman chief of the Delaware tribe, and that was, I want to say, 2012, but don't quote me on that.